Good morning, everybody. Off we go to chapter 3. And as you're aware, chapter 3 is another one of these basic chapters in economics. It's the final basic chapter in the course before we actually start getting into microeconomics specifically. And chapter 3 deals with supply and demand. So supply and demand curves are a fundamental tool in economics, both micro and macro, and we use the supply and demand curves all the time. So I would encourage you to try to become comfortable in using supply and demand curves to explain economic phenomena, just because economists use them all the time. And I tend to draw lots of supply and demand diagrams. Okay, so in chapter 3 we look at the so-called law of demand, and then we draw a distinction between a so-called change in quantity demanded versus a change in demand, and then we draw a similar kind of distinction when we come to supply curves. We look at the so-called law of supply, and we draw this distinction between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply. So when we talk about changes in quantity demanded or change in quantity supplied, we're talking about the effect of a price change on the quantity demanded or supplied. And when we talk about a change in demand or a change in supply, we're talking about the effect of non-price factors on the supply or demand curve. Okay, and we'll go through that. Okay, and then in economics, the prices in markets are established by the forces of supply and demand. So where the supply and demand curves intersect, that gives us a market price, a so-called market equilibrium price, and corresponding to that is a market equilibrium quantity. And then we know that the supply and demand curves themselves can shift due to the effect of non-price factors. And so the equilibrium price itself in a particular market can kind of bounce around and kind of so the market can be thrown out of equilibrium, and then market forces bring the market back into an equilibrium price and quantity. I mean, this is economic theory. Applying this stuff to the real world is a little bit of a different story, but that's economic theory. And it's well accepted, so it's not just theory that we don't apply. Okay, so we know that in markets, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity are determined by the interplay of supply and demand curves, supply and demand of a particular product. So chapter 3 looks at the theory behind supply and demand. I should mention that in this chapter, the authors focus on product markets. So when we speak about product markets, we mean finished products, as opposed to resource markets, as opposed to the so-called input markets, factors of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial skill or risk-taking. But even though this chapter focuses on product markets, the principles underlying supply and demand, they get applied equally to the input markets as it does to the output markets. So the authors are simply using product or output markets to illustrate the principles of supply and demand, but the same principles apply to the input markets. And we will come back to that both later in this course and in macro next term. Okay, so what is demand? So demand refers to the quantities of a particular product. I like the word product rather than goods and service myself, just because the word product is more general. But anyways, demand is the quantities of a particular product that people in the market are willing to pay at different possible prices. So all other factors remain constant when we're looking at demand, and we simply vary the price to see what different quantities of the product the market demands. And that leads us to the so-called law of demand. And that simply states that the quantity demanded for a particular product is inversely related to price. So here's our quantity on the x-axis, here's our price on the y-axis, and we can see if the price is high, we want a relatively small quantity of goods, and if the price declines, hit P2, then the quantity demanded increases. So there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. So I was going to mention that, you know, as you know, economics is a social science as opposed to a physical science. And when economists or social sciences speak of laws, they're trying to draw an analogy with the physical sciences. We tend to think that the laws of nature cannot be violated. Gravity always works according to a certain formula. But when we speak of motion and acceleration occur according to certain mathematical formulas, but when you speak of the law of demand, we're speaking of a law in a so-called social science, and things in social sciences are not necessarily quite the same as in the physical sciences. So the law of demand says that as there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, and that is true for the most part. However, there are some exceptions. I'm not sure if we'll get around to them later in this course. Maybe we will one of these days. But there are some rare exceptions. So the universality of the law of these laws in economics, they're not quite as firm as they are in some of the physical sciences or in some of the non-physical sciences. So, for example, laws of logic. We have the law of non-contradiction. So when you're developing a logical argument, you cannot violate the law of non-contradiction. And nothing can both be and not be in the same place at the same time. That's the law of non-contradiction. Okay, so we also draw this distinction between so-called money prices versus relative prices. So when we speak of a money price, the money price that we pay for a product is the amount of money that we give the vendor in exchange for the product. So we live in Canada, so we use the dollar in Canada. So the money price that I pay for gasoline, it's $1.29 a liter, $1.29. And then we also make use of the concept of relative prices. So we know that when prices change over a particular period of time, the money price can change for two different products by different percentages. So over a 1 year period, the price of gas goes from $1 a liter up to $1.20 a liter, and the price of cornflakes goes from $1 a box up to $1.50 a box. So we have different percentage changes in the two products at the same time. And if we looked at the trade value of products, if we traded gasoline for boxes of cornflakes, we would see that the relative price of the exchange rate changed as the money prices changed by different percentages in the same period of time. So we're going to look at an example of the difference between money price and relative price. I'm just going to move my little thing here. Okay, so here's the example from the book, and I have to admit I'm not a big fan of the example from the book because it focuses on DVDs and cassettes, and I don't think there are any cassettes around anymore, except maybe in a museum someplace, and even DVDs are kind of getting scarcer as well. Anyways, this is our example. So last year, it cost us $20 to buy one DVD, and this year it cost $24 to buy one DVD. And last year, it cost $10 to buy one cassette, and this year it cost $16 to buy one cassette. So we can see that intuitively, the price of DVDs increased by 40% in that 1 year period. That's $4 divided by 20, that's 20%. And the price of cassettes in the same time period increased by 60%. That's $6 increase over the original $10. That's a 60% increase. So over this 1 year period, the money price of both products increased, but they increased by different percentage amounts. And that means that the relative value of DVDs per cassette or cassettes per DVD changed over the 1 year period. If the money prices of both products increased by the same percentage during the same time period, then the relative price would have remained unchanged. But in this example, the two products had price increases by different percentage amounts. Therefore, there's a change in the relative prices. So when we look at the relative price, look at last year. So last year, this is the DVD. Oh my goodness. DVD. I'm trying to write neatly. DVD per cassette. So last year, for $20, we could buy one DVD or we could buy two cassettes. So last year, the exchange rate between one DVD and two cassettes was 2. Two cassettes was equivalent to one DVD. And this year, because of the money price changes, the ratio between DVDs to cassettes is now 1.5. So this year, for the amount of money that we can buy one DVD, we can buy 1.5 cassettes. So the price of DVDs has effectively declined in terms of cassettes. Last year it cost us 2 cassettes to buy one DVD, and this year it costs us 1.5 cassettes to buy one DVD. So the price of DVDs has declined relative to cassettes. Okay, so when we look at cassettes, we see the exact opposite. We have cassettes per DVD. So last year, $10 allowed us to buy one cassette, and $10 would allow us to buy half a DVD. So the exchange rate between cassettes to DVDs last year, cassettes to DVDs, was a half. And this year, because the prices of the two products increased by different percentage amounts, when we buy one cassette, it'll cost us $16. When we buy one DVD, it's going to cost us $24. So the number of DVDs that we can buy per cassette is only 0.67. So the cost of the relative price of cassettes has increased over this period from half a DVD to 0.67 DVDs. So this relationship, when the percentage prices of two products change by different amounts over the same period of time, and the exchange value of one product increases relative to that of the other, and the price of the other product in terms of the other decreases, this is the same principle that we're going to see in foreign exchange markets that we'll come back to later in macroeconomics the next term. Anyways, changing relative prices, we use that as well. Okay, so now off we go to our demand curve here. So as we mentioned before, there's an inverse relationship. Inverse relationship between prices. Here's our price, here's our quantity, and inverse relationship between prices and quantity demanded. As prices come down, if we start at point A here, we initially demand 10 DVDs per year. As prices come down to from $5 to $1, the quantity demanded increases. So when prices are only $1 per DVD, we demand 50 per year. Okay, so this is the demand curve for an individual buyer in the market, so an individual consumer in the market. And the demand curve for the industry as a whole is simply the sum of the demand curves. It's the horizontal sum of the demand curves for all the buyers in the market. So here's our price data here 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here's buyer number 1, buyer number 1. Here's buyer number 2. Here's the demand curve for DVDs by buyer number 1. Here's the demand curve for DVDs by buyer number 2. They're different people, so they demand different quantities at the different prices. And the quantity for the market, the quantity demanded for the market is simply the sum of the demands by the different buyers at the different price levels. And then we just plot them. So here we see that the demand curve for the market is simply the sum of the demand curves of all the buyers. So here we have price on the y-axis and quantity demanded on the x-axis. Okay, and then so this is, in this little example here, our market only has 2 buyers, but of course, you know, if we're speaking of a product like DVDs, we're probably speaking of a regional market or a national market or maybe an international market, and the quantities that we're dealing with on the market-wide basis are probably quite a bit larger than on the individual consumer level basis. And so in our table of data here for the market as a whole, here's our price schedule, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and here's our total quantity demanded at those prices by the market as a whole. And so our units are in millions of units as opposed to just tens or hundreds of units that we saw in the individual markets. And so the demand schedule for the industry as a whole is simply the sum of the quantity demanded at the different prices by all the participants in the market. And so here's our quantity in millions of units. Okay, so that's the law of demand, which says there's an inverse relationship between the price of a product and the quantity demanded by the buyers. So when we let me go to red here. So when price changes, delta P, we have a change in, that's a triangle, that's a delta, quantity demanded. So when the price changes, when the price comes down, quantity goes up, that is a movement along the demand curve. It's a movement along the demand schedule. And so we can only move along the demand curve due to a change in price. Change in price is the cause, and the change in quantity demanded is the effect. So we also know that the demand curve itself can change location. The demand curve itself can shift horizontally to the right or to the left. And when that happens, that's called a change in demand. It's a change in demand versus the change in quantity demanded. It's just it's a bit of terminology in economics. Change in quantity demanded is caused by changes in prices. Changes in demand is caused by non-price factors. Okay, so those are the two different causes of these changes. When we move along the demand curve, it's caused by a change in the price, and when we have a shift in the demand curve to the right or to the left of the original position, it's caused by a non-price change. So in the example in the book here, originally here's original demand curve for the market for DVDs. Here's our quantity demanded, here's our price. And then the federal government decides to encourage people to use computers in their schooling. So the federal government goes out and buys personal computers, and it gives those computers to all the students across the country. So if the federal government gave away zero-cost personal computers to all students in the country, then students are probably going to increase their demand for DVDs, because now they have a device to play DVDs. And so if the government gives away free personal computers to students, that's going to impact the DVD market, and getting free personal computers is a non-price change that affects the demand curve for DVDs. So it's a non-price change that increases the demand for DVDs. So I have another example of this. So this is an example from the real world, and of course we don't know that it's happening absolutely. Oops, we don't know that it's happening absolutely. Um, but this is my speculation as to what's happening. So my example is Tesla. So most students, I believe, are familiar with the Tesla. It's the big American-based electric vehicle manufacturer. And most vehicles today in the highway are not electric vehicles. They're still run by gas or diesel engines. And so Tesla is trying to encourage the purchase of Tesla vehicles or of electric vehicles around the world. So we're going to look at the North American market here. And if you have an electric vehicle, of course, you use electricity to supply the energy as opposed to gasoline. And so you need to charge your batteries on your vehicle when they run low. So I believe that most of the charging for these electric vehicles is actually done at people's houses. But certainly if you're taking a long trip across the country or across the province or something, you're going to need to charge your batteries during your trip. So what Tesla is doing is they're increasing the number of charging stations across North America. And in fact, these charging stations, if you have a Tesla vehicle, these charging stations provide free electricity. It's no cost electricity if it's a Tesla vehicle at one of these Tesla charging stations. So this data is a little bit old. I think it comes from 2012. So way back in 2012, the red dots represented the locations of the Tesla charging stations across North America. So it's 2012, and then in 2013, oh, where's my little thing here? 2013, they had a few more charging stations, and then in 2014, we can see a few more red dots going in here. And then by the end of 2015, so the end of this year, they're planning to have even more free charging stations. So what Tesla's trying to do is they're trying to increase the demand. They're trying to increase the demand for Tesla vehicles. Here's demand curve 1. Here's demand curve 2 for Tesla vehicles. Here's our quantity. Here's our price. They're trying to increase the demand for Tesla vehicles by playing around with the non-price factor. And the non-price factor is the number of charging stations across the country. Which kind of makes sense, because if you have an electric vehicle and you live in California, and if there were only charging stations in California, well, probably fewer people are going to buy electric vehicles because they're not going to be able to use those vehicles on cross-country trips. So the more and more charging stations there are across the country, that enables people to use these vehicles on long-distance trips, and that's probably going to entice more people to buy electric vehicles, especially Tesla ones. Okay, so let's keep on going. So we can have increases in our demand curve. We can have increases in, changes in non-price factors that result in an increase in demand. And likewise, we can have changes in non-price factors leading to a decrease in demand. So the example on the slides here, and I think the one in the book, is so here's our original demand curve for DVDs across Canada, let's say. So this is millions of DVDs per year. Here's the price. And then post-secondary educational institutions decide to ban the use of personal computers on campus. So if students were no longer able to use personal computers on campus, fewer students are going to use personal computers, and students are going to buy fewer DVDs. So the demand curve for DVDs would decline at all price levels. Originally, consumers, when the price is $3 per DVD, they buy 60 million DVDs per year. And when the campuses ban the use of personal computers on campus, then the number of DVDs that people demand per year declines to 40 million. So I have to admit, as I mentioned before, I'm not a big fan of using DVDs. So I have another example of this kind of non-price change affecting the demand for certain products. So here's my example. So as you know, in over recent generations, music has been recorded on different kind of media. And originally, records were recorded on vinyl records, and then the most common media was cassettes, and then it was DVD or CDs, and then today it's mostly downloads or cloud storage. So we can kind of see how the demand curve for these here's the demand curve for vinyl records. So way back in the 60s and 70s and late 80s, here's our quantity, here's our price. So here's our original demand curve for vinyl records. And as cassettes came into the marketplace, a new form of recording of music, then the demand curve for vinyl would have shifted to the left, because people wanted to have a more convenient form of storing and moving their music around, so they moved to cassettes. I mean, obviously, in the old days, you could play cassettes in your vehicles. I don't think there were ever any record players inside vehicles. So when cassettes came onto the market, that was a non-price change that affected the demand curve for vinyl. And then a few years later, of course, people had this demand curve for cassettes, and then along came CDs. And so when CDs were introduced into the market, the demand curve for cassettes declined, as we would expect, because CDs were more compact, higher quality sound. And so the demand curve for CDs, oops, that's a C. The demand curve for CDs also shifted to the left. And then of course the same thing happened again with CDs. Here's our original demand curve for CDs. And then as the technology changed for storage of music to allow downloads and music streaming and cloud storage, then the demand for CDs also declined. So these shifting demand curves for these various demand curve 2, CD1, the shifting demand curves to the left in these various recording media were all caused by non-price changes. They're caused by technological changes. Okay, so I have another fun example. This is a little bit more current. This one's from this year. So I suspect most students are aware of these so-called pods for brewing individual cups of coffee. The company that developed the coffee maker that uses these pods was called, it is called Keurig. It's now changed. I think it's now called Keurig. It's now called Green Mountain Keurig, because Green Mountain bought Keurig. But anyways, Keurig invented the coffee makers that instead of making pots of coffee, you simply make individual cups of coffee using these pods. And so this is from just this summer. So what's interesting here is that the quantity of coffee getting consumed in the United States is actually declining because of the invention of these individual coffee pods. The population of the United States is about 300 million people, and the population of the United States increases by about 1% per year, which means that there's about 3 million additional citizens in the United States every year. So even though the population of the United States is increasing by about 3 million people per year, and presumably those additional people eventually consume coffee, even though the population of the United States is increasing, the total demand for coffee in the United States is currently shifting backwards due to the invention of this is a coffee market, quantity demanded, price. Demand for coffee in the United States is actually declining because when people start making coffee with these pods, they only make as much coffee as they want to drink. Whereas the old style of making coffee is you made a big pot of coffee, and you drank your cup or two, and then you threw the rest away. And so the old style technique for making coffee by the pot resulted in high wastage. But enough of the American market has shifted to these pod coffee makers that people are just making as much as they want to consume, and so they're wasting less coffee, and so the demand for coffee is actually declining. So here it is right here. The amount consumed is expected to drop, this is 2015, from 24 million bags down to 23.7 million, and that's equivalent to a drop from 126.9 billion cups of coffee down to 125.4 billion cups of coffee. And that's from the American Department of Agriculture. Anyway, so it's kind of interesting. Here's a non-price change that's affecting the quantity of coffee that's getting consumed in the United States. Of course, eventually, population growth will overtake the offset by the new technology, but for the time being, coffee consumption in the United States is declining. Okay, so when you talk about shifts in the demand curve itself, so the demand curve shifting either to the right and increasing or shifting to the left and decreasing, those shifts in the demand curve are caused by non-price factors. So what are these non-price factors? Sorry, I'm just a little bit out of sync with my slides here. So what are some of these non-price factors? So we have an income effect. So when we speak about the income effect on demand, we have to distinguish between two types of goods. And so we have so-called normal goods and we have so-called inferior goods. So this distinction between normal and inferior goods, this is a distinction that's made in economics. It's when you come to marketing, your marketing course, you'll find other ways to classify goods. But economists draw this distinction between normal and inferior. And I have to admit, I don't really like the word goods because it applies equally to services as well. I would prefer to call these normal products and inferior products rather than goods, but what the heck, I can't change the slides, can't change, well, I guess I could, but I'm not going to change the slides, and I can't change the book. Okay, so what's the difference between so-called normal goods and so-called inferior goods? So normal goods are, normal products are products whose consumption increases when our income increases. So our demand curve for normal products, here's our demand curve 1, our demand for normal products increases when our income increases. So a good example of a normal good, I would say, would be vacations. If you're poor and you cannot afford very many vacations per year, you're going to demand this many vacations per year. But if your income goes up and you become affluent, you probably consume, here's quantity 1, you probably consume more vacations per year, or you consume more expensive vacations per year. Okay, and then we have, so most products in our economy are normal products. However, there are also products known as inferior products, and inferior products, of course, work the opposite way. With inferior products, as our incomes go up, our demand for them decline. And there's all sorts of products that, here's D1, here's D2. As income goes up, our demand for these products declines. So this is a non-price change. So good examples of these are things like, you know, for most people, craft dinner is an inferior good because most people who eat craft dinner are relatively poor. Students are notorious for being relatively poor and for eating more craft dinner than other segments of the population. So if you are eating lots of craft dinner today and you get a job where you're paid more money, you'll probably shift your consumption away from craft dinner to something else, and so your demand curve for craft dinner will decline. So other good examples of inferior goods are used vehicles. So who drives used vehicles? Well, relatively less affluent people. And if you come across more money, you're probably going to buy a new vehicle rather than a used vehicle. So the demand curve for used vehicles probably shifts to the left as your income increases. And then another good final example that students often understand is living at home, living with mom and dad. So why do people live with mom and dad, especially as you become an adult? It's probably because you're poor and you can't afford an apartment. So if you come into more money in your life and you're originally living with mom and dad, and now you have more money, you get a good job, so you can afford your own apartment or you can afford your own house, then your demand curve for living with mom and dad is probably going to shift to the left. So living with mom and dad is a common it's a common inferior good, even though you probably get laundry service and meals at the same time. Anyways, okay. So next non-price factor that can shift demand curves is changes in tastes and preferences. So there's all sorts of products here that we can illustrate how changes in taste and preferences affect the demand curves. So I have a couple examples. So one example, and we've already seen it, is the demand for pod coffee. Here's our original demand curve for pod coffee, and as pod-based coffee becomes more popular, the demand for pod-produced coffee increases, even though the demand for coffee as a whole decreases. The demand for this particular style of coffee making increases. So some other examples are tattoo removal. So here's our original demand curve for tattoo removal. So a bunch of people go out and get tattoos. Here's D1. And then as people get older, people tend to have second thoughts about some of the tattoos that they acquired when they were younger. And so as we get older, our demand for tattoo removal increases. And so this is an article from last year about how tattoo removal services have been increasing quite dramatically. I guess this is American data, but anyways, so as we get older, what was attractive in your 20s is no longer so attractive in your 30s. And so if you stay alive and you have some tattoos, it's a pretty good chance that someday you're going to want to remove some of your tattoos, and your demand curve for tattoos will increase. D1, D2. Okay, so I have another fun little example here, and it's a demand for Jell-O. So here's our original demand curve for Jell-O. You know, little kids love Jell-O. Why do little kids love Jell-O? It's because their mothers buy packs of Jell-O. Oops, got this backwards here. I got this backwards. D1. The demand curve for Jell-O has been declining. Demand for Jell-O has been declining. Why? Because people perceive Jell-O to be not as nutritious as other forms of desserts. We kind of look at Jell-O as flavored water with sugar in it, and that's not as healthy for us as other desserts, or it's not perceived to be as healthy for us as other forms of desserts. So the demand for Jell-O has been shrinking. So in 2009, in the United States, Jell-O sales were almost $1 billion per year, $932.5 million. And last year, so this is 2014, I believe, demand for Jell-O had declined to only $753.8 million. So the demand for Jell-O has been declining. Okay, so there's some non-price factors affecting demand curve for some products. Okay, so another non-price factor is price of so-called complements and price of so-called supplements. Or substitutes, sorry, complements and substitutes. Complements and substitutes. Okay, so a good example of products that are complements, a good example of complementary products are houses and appliances. So let's draw our demand curve for appliances. So appliances, washers, dryers, dishwashers, and so on. So if the prices of new houses go up, people are going to buy fewer new houses. And if the market buys fewer new houses, then the demand for washers and dryers and dishwashers and microwave ovens and like is going to decline. So if the price of houses go up, the demand curve for complementary products like appliances will decline. And then likewise, the opposite happens with so-called substitutes. So here's our original demand curve. You know, I keep saying I don't drink soft drinks, but I know lots of people do. So you know, you've got Coke and you've got Pepsi. So here's our original demand curve for Coke. So here's our original demand curve for Coke. So if the price of Pepsi goes up, and I know that people are somewhat connoisseurs of their soft drinks, and you know, you either fall into the Coke camp or the Pepsi camp, but for someone like me who doesn't drink soft drinks, to me they're just colas. So to me, they're substitutes for one another. So if the price of Pepsi goes up, that's going to mean that more people will shift away from their demand for Pepsi, and they'll increase their demand for Coke. So if the price of Pepsi goes up, people will shift into a substitute. And of course, if the price of Pepsi goes down, people will shift out of consuming Coke into Pepsi, and the demand curve for Coke will shift to the left. And another fun example, I'm kind of running out of space here, but another fun example is the demand for smoked tobacco. So smoked tobacco, so cigarettes and pipe tobacco and all that kind of stuff. So here's our original demand curve for smoked cigarettes, and then in recent years we've seen more and more of these e-cigarettes. And so as e-cigarettes have become more common, the demand for smoked tobacco has declined. And so the invention because smoked tobacco and e-cigarettes, they're substitutes for each other to some extent. So as people shift into the consumption of e-cigarettes, they shift out of the consumption of smoked tobacco, and so the demand curve for smoked tobacco shifts to the left. Okay, so we have two more non-price factors that can also affect the location of the demand curve, the horizontal location of the demand curve. We have the so-called expectations. So if we think that future prices of a particular product are going to go up, then the quantity demanded, or the demand, let me say, the demand today often goes up. If I think that the price of gasoline is going to go up next week because of new government taxes, my demand for gasoline today is probably going to go up because I'm going to fill my car up today when the price is still cheap. Okay, so another non-price factor that can affect the demand curve is expected future income. If we think that our income, if we think that we're going to get a raise from our employer and we're going to make more money 2 months from now, then if I think I'm going to get a raise 2 months from now by a significant amount, that might increase my consumption today of certain products. I live in a small house today. My employer tells me, hey, you're going to get a big raise on January the 1st. So maybe I move into a bigger house between now and January because I'm going to be able to afford the payments on it. uh, due to having this higher income down the road. Okay, and then finally, product availability. If we think there's going to be a shortage of a product in the market in the future, then that will drive our consumption of that product up today. It drives up the short-term consumption. So, and a good example of this, we remember a couple years ago, we had these incandescent light bulbs, and of course they're not very energy efficient and all that kind of stuff. So the government is in the process of banning incandescent light bulbs. But when the initial ban was kind of put on the calendar, people realized that there was going to be you weren't going to be able to buy incandescent light bulbs in the future. People kind of stockpiled incandescent light bulbs because they still had lamps and whatnot that wouldn't take the LEDs, or they wouldn't take the compact fluorescents. And so the demand for incandescent light bulbs increased in that short period because of this feared shortage. Okay, and then finally, a non-price factor that can shift the location of the demand curve is the population. So if our population is increasing, if our population is increasing, then we would expect demand for products to increase as well. And so eventually this will happen in the American market for coffee, even though Keurig machines today are causing the demand curve for coffee to decline. Eventually the population will overtake that effect, and in the future demand for coffee in the United States presumably will continue to increase. Okay, so the final little summary of this section of the chapter is just drawing this distinction, this fundamental distinction. It's kind of a terminological distinction between changes in demand, which refers to horizontal shifts of the demand curve increases, demand curve decreases, versus a change in quantity demanded, which is due solely to changes in price. So changes in quantity demanded refers to movements along the price curve. The change in price is the cause, and the change in quantity demanded is the effect. That's the way it works. Okay, so now that's it for the law of demand and the demand curve. So now we move off to the supply curve. And the same thing happens in a parallel fashion that we saw with demand, but of course applied to supply instead. So when we talk about supply, what is supply? So the supply of a product is the quantities of a particular product that firms, that manufacturers, that companies, that businesses are willing to sell at different possible prices. And of course, the law of supply works in the opposite fashion to the law of demand. There is a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. So the higher the price, the more quantity, here's Q1, the higher the price, the more quantity we expect suppliers to provide. Why? Because they have to bid up the prices of the inputs, and as input prices increase, they're going to need to get a higher output price in order to justify those higher input prices. We'll come back to that later in the course, but basically that's the theory behind the upward sloping supply curve. Okay, so we can draw our supply curve for an individual company, and then we can draw the supply curve for the market as a whole. And so here's our data table. Here's our prices, $5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so here's our individual firm. This is firm number 1. So if the market price for DVDs is $5, this company will produce 550,000. If the price is only $4, it'll produce only 400,000. DVDs per year, $3, 350, $2, 250,000, $1, only 200,000. So of course we can plot that. We can plot that, and here's our upward sloping supply curve for an individual company. Here's our quantity in the bottom. Here's our price on the y-axis. And then, of course, we can draw the supply curve for the industry as a whole by simply summing the supply curves for each individual firm in the industry at the different price levels. So here's our price levels: 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Supplier number 1, supplier number 2. In our 2 industry market, here's our aggregate supply, and the supply curve for our industry is simply the horizontal summation of the supply curve of each supplier in the industry. And of course, when we're only talking about individual suppliers, we're talking about DVDs in the thousands. Actually, in the old days when there were DVD manufacturers, they produced, individual companies produced them in the tens of millions. But but when we talk about the industry as a whole, our quantities are probably going to be at a higher magnitude than for an individual company. So here's our price, and here's our quantity. Here's our quantity for the industry. And of course, we can plot that, and of course, we get the same upward sloping supply curve for the industry as a whole that we have for each individual producing firms. So again, just like the demand curve, if we move along the supply curve, it's due to a change in price. So changes in price are the cause. So here's P1, here's P2. As prices increase, the quantity supplied, here's Q2, here's Q2. As the price increases, the quantity supplied will also increase. So changes in quantity supplied is the effect. Same principle that we saw with the demand curve. Okay, so likewise, similarly to the demand curve, so we can have movements along the supply curve due to changes in price, but we can also have changes in the horizontal location of the supply curve. We can have shifts in the supply curve. And when we have shifts in the supply curve, it's due to a non-price change. So what's an example here? Okay, so a good example is, so again, let's just stick to the DVD market. So this is our DVD market. Let's say, these DVD manufacturers, let's say they're still producing movies on DVDs. And so they have to pay royalties to the content owners. They have to pay royalties to the movie companies. But let's say that the DVD manufacturers negotiated a lower royalty, lower royalty. So what that means is that the cost for producing DVDs to the DVD manufacturers, the cost declines. So if the cost declines, that means the supply curve is going to shift outwards. The DVD manufacturers can now afford to produce more DVDs, and so the supply curve shifts outward. So at every price along the original supply curve, the producers want to supply a greater quantity at that price. Originally, here's original supply curve for a particular company. At $3, they're willing to supply 60 million DVDs, or that's the industry's whole, 60 million DVDs per year. And when the price of royalties declines, the whole supply curve itself shifts to the right. And so at the market price of $3, the industry is now willing to produce 90 million DVDs, and so on along the entire curve. And of course, supply curves can shift in both directions. They can increase or decrease. So likewise, supply curves can shift to the left. So in this example, so again, let's stick with DVDs. So let's say the manufacturing costs, let's say the manufacturing costs of DVDs increase, and let's say the cause of the increase is an increase. I think this is an example from the book. It's an increase in the minimum wage. So the government of the particular jurisdiction increases the minimum wage from $10 an hour up to $15 an hour. As the cost to manufacture DVDs increases, the supply curve will shift to the left. And so originally at a price of $3, my nose is itchy. Originally at the price of $3, the industry was producing 60 million DVDs per year. And with these higher costs, the supply curve shifts left. And now the industry is only willing to produce 30 million DVDs per year. Higher cost, supply curve shifts. Lower costs, higher cost, supply curve shifts left. Lower cost, supply curve shifts right. Okay, so just the way we saw with the demand curve, when we have changes in quantity demanded, we move along the curve. So if you have changes in quantity supplied, those changes are caused by changes in price. It's a movement along the curve. And when the supply curve itself shifts location, it's due to non-price factor. Changes in non-price factors. So, okay, so the example, so what are some examples of these different types of non-price factors? So we've already seen some changes in costs. So if the cost of our resources, if the cost of our factors of production, if the cost of our so-called inputs, if they decrease, then the supply, if they decrease, our supply curve will shift out. And if our costs increase, our supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, and then we can have changes in technology. So if our industry experiences a technological improvement that results in lower costs, then the supply curve will shift out. S2, S1. So I have a little example of this. So the example is solar power. We know that in our society, in our economy today, we don't actually have a lot of solar power production, and part of the reason for that is the cost of producing energy through solar power is still more expensive than through alternative sources. So, you know, this comes from a couple years ago, so some of this stuff might be a little bit dated. So, and it's American data, so anyways, it doesn't matter. So in the United States, it costs about 50 cents per watt to produce energy from fossil fuels. So you're burning natural gas, for example. We do this in Alberta. We burn natural gas to produce electricity. We burn coal to produce electricity. In some places, they burn oil to produce electricity. And in the United States, it costs about 50 cents per watt to produce electricity when you're burning a fossil fuel. So so today, the cost to produce a watt of power costs about 75 cents per watt, which is quite a bit more than fossil fuels. So if it's cheaper to produce power from fossil fuels, we're not going to use as much solar energy. However, in recent years, there's been quite a bit of innovation in the solar power industry, and the cost of these solar panels is in the process of decreasing due to some of these innovations. And this new material that can be used in solar power manufacturing or solar power production should allow energy to be produced at between 10 to 20 cents per watt, which is lower than solar powers. So what we would expect to happen here is due to this change in technology, we expect the production of solar power, there's a first supply curve for solar power, we expect the supply curve for solar power to increase in in future years. And the technology, it's based on, I don't know if this is I don't know if it's a mineral or a chemical, but anyways, there's something called perovskites. that are very efficient at conducting electricity. And if this technology can be commercialized, we expect the supply curve for solar power uh, to increase, which means the supply curve should shift to the right. Anyways, we'll have to stay tuned to see if this in fact actually happens. And we'll have to wait and see, especially given the price of oil is so low today. Anyways, okay, so we have the impact of changes in taxes and changes in subsidies. And when we talk about the effect of taxes and subsidies, we're really coming back to the cost of inputs. So here's our original supply curve, and we know that if production costs increase, our supply curve will shift to the left. So if one of those cost increases is an increase in taxes, the government increases the CPP and EI premiums required of employers on employees, or the government increases the sales tax, or the government increases the some other taxes on raw materials. So if producer taxes go up, the supply curve will shift to the left. And of course, if taxes decrease and the cost of production decreases, then the supply curve will shift to the right. And we'll come back to the effect of taxes later on. I can't remember if it's in this course. I think it's in macro. It's actually in macro. We talk more about the effect of taxes. And likewise, subsidies effectively lower taxes. Subsidies effectively lower cost to producers. So if the value of subsidies increases, that decreases the supplier costs, and the supply curve will shift to the right. And if subsidies decrease, that means the relative cost to producers increases, and the supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, so likewise, price expectations. So if producers expect here's our original supply curve here. If producers expect prices for their products are going to increase in the future, they might curtail their supply today and kind of build an inventory of the product so they can take advantage of the higher price in the future. So here's quantity one. Manufacturer thinks that the prices are going to increase in the future. So they curtail their supply today, wait for the product price to go up, and then they take advantage of that higher price. Okay, and then the final item here is number of companies in the industry. So as we would sort of expect, it's kind of like the population size of producers in the industry. If the number of producers in the industry increase, then we would expect the supply curve for the industry as a whole also to increase. And that's generally true. We'll come back to the nature of firms and this kind of stuff in chapters, I think it's 8, 9, and 10. Anyways, we'll come back to this later in the course. Okay, so final little summary here, same kind of summary that we had for the demand curve. We have to draw this distinction between changes in supply versus changes in quantity supplied. So changes in quantity supplied are caused by changes in price, and changes in supply itself are caused by non-price factors. And then we have a little diagram here. Oops. I think I missed something here. Just a sec. Oh, something skipped. Oh. Well, I guess we don't. Okay, it's just describing it. Sorry, it's just describing it. Okay, so when we talk about changes in supply, we're talking about a shift of the supply curve. S1, S2, S3. I thought there was a diagram, but there's not. And when we talk about a change in quantity supplied, we're referring to a movement along the curve. So we move along the curve, and this is only caused by change in price. Change in price is the cause, and quantity, change in quantity is the effect. Anyways, same kind of concept that we have in demand. Okay, so the next little section talks about how the forces of supply and demand work to establish prices in a particular market for the product. And again, I mentioned before, in this section of the book, we're simply looking at output markets, we're looking at product markets, but of course the principles of supply and demand apply equally to input markets, and we will come back to this later in the course. Anyways, so here's our little data table, here's our price schedule for DVDs, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here's our supply schedule. Here's our demand schedule. And of course, we can measure the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded at different prices. So so of course, we're going to draw a little diagram here. We're going to have a demand curve and we're going to have a supply curve. We see that they intersect. There's quantity and there's price. And they're going to intersect at a price of $3. And if that's the price of $3. And if the price is more than $3, what are we going to see? We're going to see that the quantity supplied is going to be higher than the quantity demanded. And so that's going to give us a so-called surplus. And if the price, so that's if the price is 5, and if the price is lower than this so-called equilibrium price, then the quantity supplied is going to be less than the quantity demanded, and then we're going to have a so-called shortage. And then the forces of supply and demand work to eliminate any surpluses or shortages in the market, and the price and quantity gravitate to the so-called equilibrium price of $3 in our example here. Okay, so here's our supply and demand. Here's our original supply and demand curve. Here's our equilibrium price equilibrium, and at $3. And here's our equilibrium quantity, QE. So if by example the market was not in equilibrium, but instead the price was actually at $1, what's going to happen? If the price is only $1, then the potential buyers are going to demand 100 million units. But the suppliers, they're only going to be willing to supply 20 million units. So we can see right off the bat there that we have this shortage in the marketplace. Quantity demanded is demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So there's a shortage. So markets don't like shortages, but anyways, we'll come back to that in a minute. So what's going to happen here is that the price is going to have to increase, and the price will gravitate towards the equilibrium price. And as the price increases, then the suppliers are going to supply more. Suppliers are going to move along their supply curve, and potential buyers are going to demand less. Here, at a price of $1, the market demands 100 million units, but at the price of $3, the market demands only 60 million units. So as the market price increases, demand is curtailed, and prices gravitate towards the so-called equilibrium price. And then sort of the opposite happens so here's our equilibrium price here, P3, and here's our equilibrium quantity here, QE. If by chance the market price happened to be higher than the equilibrium price, then what happens? We're going to have suppliers willing to supply 100 million units, and potential buyers are only going to be willing to buy 20 million units. So we're going to have this surplus in the market. We're going to have the surplus, so 80 million divided by 20 million. We're going to have a surplus of 20 million units in the market. So suppliers aren't going to want to have a surplus because the suppliers, these are businesses, they have all this money invested in this inventory. And if the inventory is not going to sell at this high price, they're going to want to cut their price, get their money out of that inventory, and put their investment into another product. So suppliers are going to cut their price in order to stimulate demand. So as suppliers cut their price, they're willing to supply less quantity. So they shift from 100 million units down to 60. And as the price comes down, the law of demand says that the quantity consumed will increase. So as the price comes down, consumption increases. And again, prices gravitate towards the so-called equilibrium price. And then at equilibrium here, this equilibrium price is also called the so-called market clearing price. And what market clearing means is surpluses are cleared from the market. So this original surplus goes away. And likewise, shortages are also cleared. Shortages are cleared. So the equilibrium price clears any surpluses or shortages in the market. Here's the original shortage down here. So it's the equilibrium price. Here's my fun way of looking at the equilibrium price. This is kind of like Goldilocks and Three Bears. You've got the porridge is too cold, the porridge is too high, and then the porridge is just the right temperature. So likewise, in the market, if the price is too low, then we're going to have a shortage, and if the price is too high, we're going to have a surplus. And then eventually, market forces drive the price to equilibrium, so the price that's just right, that clears the market of shortages and surpluses. Okay, so the final little section here, so we know that the market price is determined by the interplay of supply and demand. So the market price eventually gravitates towards the equilibrium price, and the market quantity gravitates towards equilibrium quantity. And then we know that, as we saw earlier in the chapter, the supply and demand curves themselves can shift. They can shift horizontally due to changing non-price factors, and that means that the market can be put out of equilibrium. The market goes into disequilibrium, and it causes the market participants to adjust their behavior in order to bring the market back in equilibrium. So economists have this famous concept, called equilibrium. So it's the point where supply and demand curves intersect to give us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. It's quite a famous concept, and in theory, the equilibrium pricing quantity are relatively stable, at least in the minds of economists, and that's why it's called equilibrium. However, that's the theory. I'll just say that's the theory. Okay, so this final section here, we have 4 different scenarios we're going to look at. We have 4 scenarios. The first scenario is our demand curve. Our demand is going to increase, and the supply curve is going to stay constant. So what happens? So here's our original demand curve here. Here's the original supply curve here. Here's the original equilibrium price. Oh, I've got an eraser. Here's our original equilibrium price here, and here's our original equilibrium quantity here, QE1. So let's say our demand curve increased. Let's say our demand curve shifts outwards. What happens? Initially, there is a shortage. It's an initial shortage. So at price P1, after the demand curve shifts out, the market now demands Q3. The market demands Q3, but the suppliers are only willing to supply Q1. So we have a shortage. So what's going to happen? The buyers are going to have to increase their price in order to entice a greater supply from suppliers. And our new equilibrium price, this is price equilibrium 1, our new equilibrium price is going to gravitate to this point here. There's our new PE2, and we can see that that quantity there is going to be a little bit lower than the original quantity demanded when the demand curve originally shifted. So that's exactly what happens here. I'm just going to continue this on. So we have original equilibrium price here, original equilibrium quantity here. Demand curve shifts out. The market is out of equilibrium. There's originally a shortage, and so the price has to, buyers have to increase their price. The price increases, and the quantity increases, and we end up at a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. Okay, so that's when demand increases and supply stays the same. Okay, so then we can look at the opposite scenario. So this is scenario 2 out of 4 here. So this is where we have demand decreases and supply stays the same. So here's our original demand curve. There's price equilibrium price 1. Here's our equilibrium quantity 1. And then the demand curve shifts to the right. So originally we have an initial surplus. So that's represented by this quantity here. So when the demand curve suddenly shifts to the left, we have a surplus at P1. The market's willing to supply Q1, but the market only wants to buy Q2. So we have the surplus. So buyers are going to have to cut their price. They're going to have to cut their price. And as they cut their price, that will stimulate the law of demand. So as the price declines, quantity demanded increases. And then we'll end up at a new equilibrium here, QE3. And this will be our new price equilibrium. I'm going to call it 3. So the price will come down. The price will come down. So that's exactly what happens. So the price comes down. So the price comes down. Quantity demanded goes up, and we end up at a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. So when demand contracts, eventually the price will come down, and the quantity supplied will also decline. Okay, so now we go on to scenario number 3. So with scenario number 3, we're going to change our supply. So we have a 3 out of 4 here. So in this scenario, here's our original demand curve. Here's our original. So we're going to have supply increase, and demand is going to stay. Demand is going to stay constant. That's a D. Demand is going to stay constant. So here's our original demand curve. Here's our original supply curve. Here's our original price here. Here's our price equilibrium 1. So if the supply curve shifts outwards, we're going to have an initial surplus. So when we have a surplus, producers aren't going to want to have a surplus. Suppliers are going to have to. So with this initial surplus, we have suppliers willing to supply quantity Q3, but at that price, buyers only want to buy Q1, so we've got the surplus in the market. So in order to clear the surplus, suppliers are going to have to decrease the price, and as the price declines, the quantity demanded is going to increase, and we're going to arrive at this new equilibrium price here, P2, and we're going to arrive at a new equilibrium quantity here. So and that's exactly what happens. So as our quantity supplied, as the supply curve shifts out, price is going to drop, and the quantity equilibrium quantity is going to increase. And then finally, our final scenario is 4 to 4 here. So this is where supply decreases and demand stays constant. So here's our original supply curve, here's our original demand curve, here's our original equilibrium price, here's our original equilibrium quantity, Q2, E1. And as the supply curve shifts left, we at P1 we end up with an initial shortage. Why? Because at P1, originally people want at P1 the market demands this quantity, but at P1 after the supply curve is shifted, suppliers are only willing to supply this quantity. So we have a shortage of this amount. So if there's a shortage in the market, buyers know that they're going to have to increase their price in order to entice suppliers to increase the quantity supplied, and that's going to result in a new equilibrium price where the two curves intersect, P2, and that's going to give us a new equilibrium quantity, Q2, QE2. Anyway, so that's exactly what happens. So as the supply curve shifts to the left, price is going to increase from the disequilibrium situation, and the quantity is also going to, so price is going to go up and the quantity is going to contract. Okay, and then as you can kind of guess, the last little slide here really just talks about, there's so many, in real markets, there's non-price, changes to non-price factors occurring in both the supply market and the demand markets at the same time, or to the forces of supply and demand at the same time. And so it's sometimes difficult to predict exactly how prices will shake out at the end of the day, because these changes in prices and changes in non-price factors, they're constant. They're constant. So in theory, these supply and demand curves are always sort of shuffling around. Anyways, so the book's final example here is just an example of how changes in the supply and demand can occur at the same time. And I think the example is with babysitting services. So in our original situation, here's our demand curve for babysitting services in a particular neighborhood, and here's our supply curve for babysitters in a particular neighborhood. So here's our equilibrium price here, price equilibrium 1, quantity equilibrium 1, price and quantity here. And then people in this particular neighborhood, they have more babies, and so the demand curve for babysitters shifts outwards, and so the price kind of gravitates to here at this quantity here. And then the babysitters in the neighborhood, the previous babysitters, they grow older and then they move out of town or they get jobs, and so the supply of babysitters contracts. So what's the net impact on the market? Well, originally we had, this is our equilibrium quantity and this is our equilibrium price right here, and if the demand for babysitters increases and the supply of babysitters decrease, we know that the price is going to go up, and then the quantity is probably going to gravitate back towards the original location. Maybe other babysitters from other neighborhoods have to move into the area. But we can kind of see that if both the demand curve and the supply curve are shifting around at the same time, then it's difficult to predict what the final equilibrium price and final equilibrium quantity is going to be. And so some of the final impact is going to be unknown. Anyways, that's just the nature of markets, and that's why we use these things called models. That's why we use things called supply and demand to try to understand the impact of different factors individually. And although we may be able to understand the impact of individual factors individually, whether in the demand side or the supply side, we might not be able to fully understand what the final effect is going to be when all the factors shake together. And that's kind of why in markets we often see prices jump around. In the gasoline market, we always complain about the price of gasoline going up, but sometimes it comes down. It's always bouncing around. Stock market bounces around like a Mexican jumping bean. Again, it's because there's all these factors, non-price factors, affecting supply and demand curves. Anyways, that's it for chapter 3. And next week we're off to chapters 4 and chapter 6, dealing with elasticities of supply and demand. Anyways, we'll talk to you later.